I was a stranger, brother, out in sin. Didn't even have the love of God within. But now I found him and I'm glad to say I love my Savior more every day.
Shawn's recent video on moral theory expands the ideas of Alasdair MacIntyre and that particular idea of virtue. As I've said in my most recent video, I have become interested in the study of virtue ethics and have not only read MacIntyre, but also read a lot of the criticism of him and a lot of the surrounding works. Like many of his contemporaries, MacIntyre, like Williams, like Philippa Foot, was convinced that the modern era, that is, since the Enlightenment, has been far too focused on a rule-based system of ethics, and because of this has neglected certain aspects of ethical character which are commonly called the virtues. This video seeks to ask, historically, did we forget the virtues? To begin, let's trace before the Enlightenment and start at the High Middle Ages. In many respects, the loss of character focus can be attributed to the renewed focus of Christian common morality. The Christian philosopher Thomas Reid was adamant about the distinction. He wrote, "The ancients commonly arranged the morals under 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. Christian writers, I think more properly, under the 3 heads of duty we owe to God, ourselves, and to our neighbor." 2 points here being that largely we owe the neglect of virtue to Christian thinking and not to secular thinking, and secondly, that common morality in the Christian context is ultimately dependent on a system of relations between God, society, and the self. This makes all action to a certain extent relative to that relation and hence not completely objective. The later Puritan divine, William Perkins, continued to emphasize this notion that the virtue can be subsumed under the law by saying the universal justice is the practice of all virtue, of that whereby a man observes the commandments of the law. The dominance of the act-centered and legal framework of morality was further supported by John Locke when he wrote, "By whatever standards soever we frame in our minds the ideas of virtues and vices, the vicissitude or obliquity consists in the agreement with those patterns prescribed by some law." In sharp contrast to the virtue theories, the rule and act-based moral theories delineate behavior very explicitly and concentrate on what a moral agent must do rather than the type of character that they are supposed to have. I would agree with Locke that the virtues must in some sense be either reducible with or compatible to a more explicit moral law that governs all behavior of the agent. Virtue is not being eliminated here as MacIntyre and Shawn would have us believe, it is merely becoming more intelligible by extracting from these various notions a more precise way of discussing the properties of behavior which distinguish a virtuous person from a non-virtuous one. I can further this claim of virtues that virtues can be accounted by rule-based ethical theories by citing a distinction again from a Christian by the 15th century Christian moralist and apologist Hugo de Groot. He divided them between perfect duties and imperfect duties. Perfect duties are these that are necessary for social life to continue and must be obeyed in all times. Imperfect duties are those which, 1, are not necessary for society, and 2, are not of particular relevance. They add benefit to social life, but are not absolutely necessary. And then, in this sense, they explicitly mirror the virtues of charity and wisdom, which de Groot uses in his analysis. The tradition set out by de Groot appears to also have influenced David Hume, who sought to distinguish between what he called artificial and natural virtues in his treatise of human nature. Note once again that virtue is being discussed well into the Enlightenment period, it is just being divided. According to Hume, the artificial virtues included keeping promises, justice, and allegiance to the government, while natural virtues included things like meekness, charity, and equity. In all cases, the issues around virtue have not been totally lost, but rather have been reappropriated into a more clear and precise set of rules which have all got a common legalistic foundation. Nowhere is this more evident than in the theory of moral sentiments, proposed by another famous Enlightenment theorist, the economist and philosopher Adam Smith, who criticized the virtues for their lack of clarity and consistency above all else. Smith's moral system, although complicated, similarly arises out of the aggregate moral sentiments held by most people in that given society. Virtue in Smith's discussion is merely one of three parts of an ethical framework, which he divides between virtue, ethics, and jurisprudence. Although Smith finds virtue to be useful, for instance, in the education of children, he criticizes it as a very imprecise form of ethics. Smith's ultimate goal is closer to jurisprudence, which is far more formal and rigorous in determining rights, obligations, and commitments towards one's own character. It's clear from the writing of many 20th century moral philosophy that many take this to be a definitive case against not only virtues, but those who are, like Hume, who are at least sympathetic to the view that we could have virtues so long as these could be separated and broken between those which are directed for the benefit of the self and those that are directed to the benefit of society. We can close this historical examination of the virtues with a discussion of Kant, who frequently lectured and wrote on the topic of perfect and imperfect virtues following Hume. In his criminally underread book, Dreams of a Spirit Seer, there is quite an ample discussion. Here, Kant makes little room for emotion or character, or even feeling, within this moral doctrine, and instead focuses his attention almost exclusively in taking the virtues and putting them in a rule-based duty, which are required to be compatible with the logical consequences of universalizing this rule. This quite obviously betrays the history of de Groot and Reid and Christian common morality, which Kant was working under, and shows the history of modern moral philosophy has been one of moving progressively away from the intuitions of virtue and rather more taking those virtues and putting them into a tangible set of moral rules. Further discussion of the virtue after that work in Kant becomes quite spotty. The philosopher Jerome Schneewind has traced Kant in this area quite well, and shown that he discusses it briefly in the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, actually even then only in a footnote, and in Metaphysics of Morals, Kant largely takes the issue of virtue once again to have been replaced by the discussion of perfect and imperfect duties. Kant epitomizes this movement by placing the justification of morality within reason and compelling moral agents with duty rather than emotions or drive towards excellence or love of God. Furthermore, Kant's discussions of the imperfect duties revolves around the question of whether one could perform them without confusion of whether the agent was performing them in the right way. This is wholly absent from virtue theory, in my opinion. The obvious preference is therefore aimed towards perfect duties, which can be carried out with relative certainty. The attentive listener will also note that this plays out a greater role in the categorical imperative and the distinction between the hypothetical imperative. We might do a video on that soon. In conclusion, we see that Enlightenment thinking has not abandoned virtue, as MacIntyre has suggested, but rather clarified and expounded those themes. Importantly also for Shawn is that if we are going to blame anyone for the demise of virtue theory, it would certainly be the common Christian moral theorists, such as Reid and de Groot. A final thought is Anscombe's work in the contemporary period asks a question familiar to many people here, many apologists, of how we can have a moral law without a divine lawgiver, and therefore questions the basis of the sort of legalistic rule-based framework of morality. I believe that this was actually taken up by Anscombe's disciple, Philippa Foot, who is largely credited with the revival of virtue ethics. Foot was an atheist, and she could not accept the notion of a divine lawgiver, which begs the question then of how we would place morality without that law. Her answer was to go back to the ancient ideas of virtue, which, unfortunately for Shawn, again, are very secular in nature, that they have more to do with the teleos of the individual, which is not determined by a divine lawgiver, but rather can be determined through a sort of analysis that's given by, like, Aristotle and Plato. In conclusion, I think that Shawn is missing a couple of key points, mainly that Christian philosophers were the beginning of the neglect of virtue, and secondly, that virtue hasn't really been neglected, it's just become more clear. It has moved away from intuition and into discussion. Thank you.